Welcome to the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. I'm Melisa Liberman, a fellow IC and business coach. On this podcast, I teach you to become a consistently booked independent consultant without becoming a pushy salesperson or working 24/7. If I can do it, you can too. Listen on to find out how. Welcome to episode 165 of the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. This is Melisa Liberman, and I am thrilled you're here today because today we're going to talk about something that I find to be a common question that I get from independent consultants like you, which is how do I get in front of more decision makers? How do I get in front of more decision makers so I can increase my close rate? And so that's the question that I want to help you address today so that you can land more consulting work, more high quality consulting work with clients you can't wait to work with, and also paying you the rates that you deserve to be paid, the fees rather. So with that, let's dive into the agenda for today. First, I'll go over the companion resource with you so that it will help you put this episode into action. And then we'll talk about why get in front of decision makers in the first place. Seems really obvious, but I want to really touch on that because sometimes we think we need to go do something without really thinking about why we're doing that. So I want to take a step back and talk about why get in front of decision makers and why not. This might surprise you, but there are reasons why not to worry about getting in front of decision makers. So I want to highlight that for you to help parse this out and help make your plan for lead generation more effective as a result. And then we'll talk about some common blockers that I frequently see that prevent consultants like you from getting in front of those decision makers or in front of your potential clients directly. Then we'll talk about a few prerequisites you want to have in place in order to get in front of those decision makers. I'll share with you some real life examples, and then we'll wrap it all up to talk about how to put this episode into action. So that's why we're here today. First, I had to give you a personal update though. Last weekend was the first weekend of my kids' summer swim season, which is called long course. It's where they swim in an Olympic size swimming pool. And so anyway, we had a meet at the Air Force Academy. I live in Colorado Springs. It's close to the Air Force Academy. And my 13-year-old got to swim against these cadets. So they are essentially in college level swimmers. He's 13 and he got to swim in these events against these college cadets, which was so fascinating of course, he did not win. Let's be clear. They're trying to get Olympic level trial qualifying times, these cadets. So that's why they were swimming. They were just looking for a meet to swim in to get a time. They were not swimming against 13-year-old. I don't think it was sort of toward the top of their list. But anyway, it was really fascinating just to see the level of motivation that he had. I think I talked with you a little bit about this week, but now that it's completed, to share with you what happened, to see that level of motivation that someone in front of him, someone who's, obviously further along and older and more experienced in swimming, and how much that elevated his performance and he cut so much time off of his events. And so, kind of following on with what I was sharing with you last week, is so fascinating when we're running our businesses and thinking about it from that perspective. Not that we're behind, or not that we're qualified enough or missing too many skills, not focusing on what you don't have, but focusing on what's possible for you and making this parallel for you from the swim meets. When you're running your business and thinking about it from that vantage point of what's possible for you, when you see other consultants who might be further along, or it may be easier for them to run their business, at least from your vantage point externally, just really think about it in that context of there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing missing from you. You're not missing any skill sets. This is them showing you what's possible. So that's what happened at that swim meet with the cadets. It was really fun to see him be able to compete against those college level swimmers and perform at a level that he didn't previously think was possible. So that's what's happening over here behind the scenes. Now let's dive into this week's episode, which is all about how to get in front of your ideal client decision makers. With that, let's go through agenda item number 1, which is the companion resource. This week, we're back to the book. So Chapter 9 of the Grow Your Consulting Business, that chapter focuses on your lead generation system to uncover high quality opportunities. So part of what we're talking about today is how to get in front of those decision makers, and that's part of your lead generation system. So go download the book. It's on my website and there are a couple of shortcut URLs, consultingbusinessbook.com, or I just made it really simple, melisabook.com. If you've listened to this podcast before, you'll know my name is spelled Melisa, but I also bought the URL Melisa with 2 S's just in case, because so many people spell it that way. So anyway, that's where you can go download the book and check out Chapter 9, which focuses on the breadth of your lead generation system to uncover high quality opportunities. And today we're talking about one sliver of that, which is how to get in front of decision makers. Why should you get in front of decision makers? This seems obvious. Why am I even telling you this? But if we just take back the layer a little bit and think about, why do you want to get in front of decision makers? It's important because it leads us into why not. Why not get in front of decision makers? And that's what we're going to talk about next. So let's start with why get in front of decision makers. This is how you can, in some ways, make the most out of your business development time. You might be thinking, when you're meeting with decision makers and not necessarily other people who don't have any authority, it can make your business development, the time that you have to spend on business development, much more effective, much more efficient, much more impactful. It also helps you to move the needle in your business in the sense of adding work to your pipeline and having the opportunity to close that versus it going to a no decision, versus just checking the box, knowing that you're doing lead generation and talking to people, but it not going anywhere because you're really checking the box, sometimes maybe talking to people, but they don't have any budget or any authority, and therefore it doesn't go anywhere. And ultimately, you're wanting to talk to decision makers in order to land business. So these are all obvious things. I want to point these out to you because on the flip side, sometimes these thought processes and these goals and these ultimate reasons to get in front of decision makers can sabotage the work that you're doing from a business development perspective. And that's what leads us into why not get in front of decision makers. By this, I mean, eventually you need to get in front of a decision maker. But sometimes we put too much pressure on ourselves to get in front of decision makers immediately, or only get in front of decision makers, or get in front of decision makers too quickly. And when we're not doing those things, when we're not getting in front of decision makers as quickly as we want to, or we think we should go straight to the decision maker, then we end up sabotaging ourselves because we discount the other conversations and opportunities that we have to meet the people who are influencing those decision makers. We end up dismissing the conversations that it takes to build buy-in with people who are influencing those decision makers, or who can really turn into more of an internal coach for you. So when you're meeting people at your ideal clients, or even connectors to your ideal clients, and they don't have the decision-making authority, or they don't have the budgetary authority, that is not a problem. You want to be looking at those relationships that either you've already got or that you're creating, and be thinking about them from the perspective of, how can you create and nurture this relationship in such a way that they will introduce you to those decision makers, that they will help you to shortcut the time that you end up needing to take with the decision makers, because they're able to influence the decision maker. They can shortcut the conversation with the decision maker because they know what they care about and what they don't care about. They can help you, coach you, from an internal perspective, to say, this is what that decision maker really cares about and what they don't care about, so that you can really put your best forward once you do get into their calendar. And so This is why it can be really important to not over index on trying to get in front of decision makers, solely focusing your efforts along that. A lot of times I work with independent consultants who tell me, I just need to be more efficient with my time. I don't have a lot of time for business development. So I need to make sure I'm talking to the decision maker. I need to get to the decision maker. And so what I like to call this is premature efficiency. Premature efficiency. When you don't have enough reps under your belt, or maybe you don't have as much inbound lead coming into your pipeline, sometimes focusing on becoming really efficient with the work that you're doing is just premature. When you get to the place in your business where you have a lot of inbound interest, where you don't have a lot of time, where you have a really solid business development process, and you know what your close rate percentage is, and you know what the qualification factors are of working with a client, and what might knock out a client because they're not really ideal for you. When you get to that place, then it makes sense for you to really focus on how do you get into the decision maker's office as quickly as possible, and not working with, a lot of the people that are not the decision maker. But before you get to that spot in your business, it can be really important to not prematurely worry about the efficiency of what you're doing. Now, I'm not talking about going in and speaking to sort of a developer, for example, who has no influence or authority over anything that you're doing or wanting to do from a consulting perspective. But what I am talking about is when you're thinking about who you want to get in, who you want to be talking to at your ideal client, to not dismiss those individuals who don't necessarily have the budget or don't have the decision-making authority, but do have the influence over the people who do have the budget and decision-making authority. So don't focus on too prematurely worrying about getting in front of the decision maker. And that's the caveat that I want to give you as we're working through today's episode. Okay, so now let's talk about where to focus instead. So if we're thinking about the decision maker and not worrying so much about getting to the decision maker, then what does that look like? What does that look like? And really what we're talking about today on this episode is how to get in front of more decision makers in the business, who then can help you to get to the place where you have a signed agreement and the budget is assigned to the work that you're going to be doing. We want to really think about broadening this out as a result. Don't focus so specifically on one decision maker, the budget owner, the decisioner. It's about finding those people in an organization who can help influence the decision, ultimately help you to craft a solution that's going to be improved, and then getting their buy-in and their sponsorship into the decision maker themselves. So we're broadening out as part of the focus today, how to get into the decision maker more quickly. We're really broadening this out to think about how to get into a potential client's awareness more quickly, how to get your foot in the door. And so that looks like having more valuable conversations with potential clients, not worrying about who you're talking to at first, taking that pressure off of not feeling like you always have to talk to the buyer, the budget owner, the decision maker, and coming at this with a consultative approach where you're thinking about really being a consultant ahead of time before they've hired you, asking really good questions about what's going on with the organization. Where are the problems that they have? Why do they care about solving those problems? What are the problems that they have, but they aren't prioritizing? And helping you to understand the lay of the land so you can be really valuable as you are meeting with them and ultimately getting that sponsorship into the ultimate decision maker and budget owner. So let's take a step back now, another direction at this topic, and talk about the two common blockers that I most often see when you're thinking about getting in front of decision makers. When you're thinking about getting in front of your ideal client more broadly, it could be likely that you're not making a very valuable offer to them. So when we're thinking about getting in front of a decision maker, Again, whether they're the ultimate decision maker or just someone in that organization who will influence the decision maker, you want to be making a valuable offer to them. And by offer, I don't mean for your services. What I mean is, why would someone get on a call with you? Why would someone have a meeting with you? Why would someone at that ideal client spend time with you and you framing it in a way that's really valuable to them? A lot of times we think we might meet someone on LinkedIn or get an introduction to them, and we're kind of at the mercy of whether they are willing to network or not network. It doesn't have to be so black and white. You can be thinking about getting in front of your ideal client, making relationships with people at that ideal client, and think about what might be valuable to them. I'll share with you a few specific examples here in a minute. Just simply offering to have a call is not a very valuable offer. Now, of course, when you've got someone in your warm network, or even sometimes when you are introduced, it can be valuable enough for them to book a call with you. A lot of times they're not, though. They're so busy, right? They're so busy, and you taking 20 minutes or 30 minutes off of their calendar is a big deal. And so you want to be thinking about, how could this be a valuable offer to them to meet you and to start a relationship? I'll give you some very specific examples here in a minute. The other common blocker that I often see that prevents consultants from getting their foot in the door and in front of any type of decision maker or influencer is the way you're thinking about yourself. So I want to talk in more detail about that, because this is really important. And we've touched on this many, many times in this podcast, but I really want to dive into it in more detail because it's really important. So this leads us to the prerequisites of how to get in front of more decision makers at your ideal clients. The prerequisites are, number one, having that valuable entry offer. And again, I'll give you a few examples of that here in a moment. There are also a couple of other episodes that we've touched on related to this. Episode 97, which is the most neglected consulting offer, which references these entry type offers. And then also episode 160, where we talked about using diagnostics to uncover consulting leads more effectively. Those both touch on this idea of entry offers. And again, I'll give you some examples here in a minute. The next prerequisite, which goes back to the common blocker, are the thoughts you're having about yourself. When you go into conversations with a decision maker, not the decision maker, right? We're talking about anyone who is influencing decisions, and ultimately the ultimate decision maker. When you go into either offering to reaching out to them and recommending that you have a call, making that entry offer, when you're thinking about yourself as more of a subordinate, as someone who's less than them in a corporate hierarchy type mindset, when you think I'm just a vendor, or or I want something from them, when you make that entry offer, it's not going to be as effective as if you were thinking about yourself as their peer, that you are an expert in the industry that they work in and you're offering valuable insights to them. You can see the difference, that slight shift that will be made when you're thinking about yourself as a peer, as an expert who's reaching out to them in some form or fashion to make an entry type offer, which really is initial interaction, right? To start a professional relationship with them. When you're reaching out thinking you're a peer to them, it can come across in the way that you write the words that you write or the words that you speak. It could come across in the way that the emotional state that you're in, whether it might be confident and clear versus hesitant and tentative. And so you really want to be thinking about the mindset that you've got as you're thinking about reaching out to get your foot in the door at an ideal client and ultimately in front of those decision makers and influencers. The third prerequisite is the thought you have about them, the mindset and the thinking that you've got about them. If you're thinking I'm bothering them, or they're not going to want to hear from yet another cold pitch, or they'll probably ignore whatever I have to say because they get so much of this every day. Most likely you're going to approach this process from the check the box type of a mentality, and ultimately kind of water down what you're offering to them, versus really thinking about it, assuming they do want to talk to you, that if they find you, it's almost that thought process of, they're looking for someone like me. They just haven't been able to find them. Imagine you raising your hand and saying, "You've been looking for me. I know that you're going to find value in what I have to say and what I have to offer to you." So thinking about your thoughts about them and getting really clear, creating that mindset for yourself before you start approaching these decision makers and decision influencers. Very specifically, the prerequisite can be they'll want to talk to me. They'll find my entry offer valuable. Giving yourself the benefit of the doubt, not expecting they probably won't want to talk to me and making them give you the benefit of the doubt. That's not what we're doing. You're creating the confidence for yourself that they're going to want to talk to you, make that assumption, and then you will come across much more clearly and powerfully as a result. So that's why those are the 3 prerequisites in place. Okay, now let's talk about those very specific examples that I promised I would share with you. So at the beginning, we were talking about, how to get in front of decision makers for your consulting services, who's going to buy your consulting services. I offered to you the suggestion that you want to really be thinking that about those decision makers in a much more broad way than you might have previously, where you're thinking about just the person who can approve the budget and sign your contract. You want to be thinking about these decision makers and influencers in a much more broad way. And then tactically, how do you get their attention? It's very rare that you might send them a cold message on LinkedIn and that they're going to respond to you, that you're going to get a meeting with them. Sometimes that happens. So we don't want to discount it entirely. But how do you create a valuable, what I call entry offer, strike up a relationship with the person, to at least have a conversation with a decision maker or influencer in an organization so that you can fill your pipeline and close more business? Here are some real life examples that you can leverage in order to get your foot in the door. The first is, and these are from real life consultants, that these are not theory. These are real life examples that have worked for consultants like you that have been able to get their foot in the door and start conversations with decision makers and decision influencers at their ideal clients, and to uncover leads that turn into consulting engagements. So the first example that I'll share with you is, and there are 5 here. The first example is that you keep track of who is your ideal client. You know what businesses those are, what companies those are. Then keep track of and pay attention to the type of writing or articles or presentations that those people in those organizations are making. So for example, I had a consultant I was working with. She was reading an article that a VP at one of her ideal target companies had written, and it was in a magazine, an industry magazine. And so she just simply reached out to that person on LinkedIn, actually. So this was an example of more of a cold outreach. And she said, listen, I read the article that you wrote. I found it so incredibly valuable. A few things that it really brought to my mind were X, Y, X really, not, it wasn't a long message, but she was just really showing that she had read the article, and then she was adding on her own spin to it, really. And that person, who was, an executive at this large company, Fortune 1000 company, responded to her, and they set up a call, and it's moved into an engagement from there. So just simply taking the time to say, thank you for this article, or thank you for this presentation that I attended. This is what I took away, and I would love to just talk with you further about this. It was as simple as that. To get onto the calendar of a VP at a company where you would maybe guess that it was never possible for you. Getting creative in that way, it can be possible for you. Another technique that's working really well for another consultant, actually several consultants who are using this technique, is to reach out to these individuals who are decision makers and influencers at your ideal clients and ask to interview them. Let them know that you're creating an article or a white paper, some kind of an asset about a specific topic in their industry, and asking them, telling them that you really value what they contribute to the industry, their experience and you've been, really watching what they've been doing, that kind of thing, and asking them to interview them to include them in the white paper. Let them know that if they need approval from their company, that you're happy to not use their name, if that makes it easier, that kind of thing, and get them on a call with you in an interview context where they're contributing. You're asking really powerful questions. They can see your industry knowledge demonstrated by the topic and the types of questions and the dialogue that you're having, and that initiates the relationship with them. Another example of to get on the calendar of a decision maker or influencer is to offer them a diagnostic. So, for example, a consultant that I was talking to, she's created a process for herself where she's created a benchmark type of an asset in her business. And so then she'll do a little bit of analysis using, publicly available information, send this benchmark report over to decision makers and other decision influencers in that organization, and then offer a call, offer a 20-minute, this is what I found. This is what I'm seeing about the organization. I'm guessing this is on your mind and probably maybe keeping you up at night. I would love to talk with you more about where how this benchmark came to be, and what I saw when I was creating it, and see if if it could be valuable to you to have a one-on-one conversation. That's what she's saying to these decision makers, and getting calls with them as a result of it. Now, another way to get on the calendar of a decision maker or influencer is to get an introduction, of course. So we'll take something that's really straightforward. Think about creatively getting an introduction. We've talked about this on the podcast before. You might look on LinkedIn, obviously, to see who the mutual connections are, or you might assume that not everyone's connected to everyone that they know on LinkedIn. Sometimes we're connected to people we don't know, and just really thinking about strategically who might know this person that I would love to get introduced to, whether it's a decision maker or a decision influencer. Who might know that person? Maybe my neighbor might know that person. Maybe my, a vendor that I know works with that company. Maybe they either know the person you want to get introduced to, or they know someone who can make the connection for you. So getting really creative about who might know this individual that you want to meet, and figuring out how to get an introduction to that individual. Another example that's working really well for consultants to get on the calendar of decision makers and decision influencers is inviting them to an industry executive roundtable. You can go to them, and this has been working really well for several of my clients, where they're putting together quarterly roundtables for their industry, for executives in the industry, and inviting those executives to the roundtable. Initially, just a free roundtable where maybe it's once a quarter or a couple times a year, where you're inviting them to meet with their peers, to talk about certain industry topics that are top of mind, and for them to be able to come away with another perspective that's not so insular for them. They spend their time in such an insular way most of the time, thinking about their problems internally, how they're going to navigate those problems, how they're going to achieve their objectives. And for them to be able to take a step out of that for a couple hours, and it can be virtual or in person, where they're really talking about what the challenges are in the industry or what the best practices are that they're seeing in the industry. And you're facilitating that and seen as an industry leader as a result. This can be really valuable. The one thing I want to say, just to take a step back and fold back in the mindset piece of this, is you've got to be thinking about yourself in order to ever approach these types of recommendations that I'm making to you, or these examples of how you can get your foot in the door. You've got to be thinking about yourself as someone who is capable of facilitating this type of roundtable, thinking about yourself as someone who's more than qualified to interview your ideal clients and create a white paper and something that they would find valuable. Don't spend your time thinking about how you're not ready for this yet, or how you're not good enough for this yet. I assure you, you'll find all sorts of reasons why. We all do. You're a human. And of course, you would find a lot of reasons that would talk you out of how you're not yet at this level, quote unquote. But I just really encourage you to be thinking, switch that around and ask yourself, how am I qualified to do this? How could I get on the calendar of these decision makers to interview them, to produce a white paper that's really valuable, not only for them, but for others in the industry? And so that leads me to the last example here, which is getting creative. Get creative. I said this to a client earlier today. I said, if I were to give you $1 million for getting on the calendar of this decision maker, what would you do? There's another episode about this $1 million question. But what would you do if the stakes were so high, $1 million to get on the calendar of this decision maker? I can assure you that you would start thinking about very creative ways to get on that person's calendar, maybe even going over to their office and sitting in the lobby, whatever it is, right? Getting on their calendar in order to make yourself known to that ideal client and ultimately starting to build relationships, whether it's with the decision maker or a decision influencer, so that you can start filling your pipeline with and building relationships with these ideal clients. So as we wrap up here today, to put this episode into action, I want to share with you several questions that you can be asking yourself in order to really think about and create a more intentional process of getting on the calendars of your ideal clients and the decision makers there and the influencers there. These 3 questions are, number 1, make sure you know who are your ideal clients. Sometimes we get stuck there. I'm not sure who my ideal client is. I could work with anyone. The type of work that I do is so transferable. I encourage you to, again, to really niche this down and think about who is your ideal client. Underscore the word ideal. Who is your ideal client? Get really clear about that. Then the second question is, what approaches do you want to test out to get your foot in the door? So oftentimes we want to focus on, tell me if this is going to work or not. I can tell you, I just gave you 5 or 6 examples of approaches that absolutely 100% work. I've seen them in action. And some of them I've done myself. I don't know if it's going to work for you. I don't know if it's going to work for you. I don't know if it's going to work or resonate with your ideal client, and neither do you. And that's not a problem. You want to really put these approaches into place from an experimental mindset to test them out and see what works best for you. Maybe you hate facilitating a executive roundtable. And so you try it once and you realize that's not for me, but I know I could interview these ideal clients and create some really interesting white papers and assets that are valuable not only to that person, but to other potential clients in the industry. But you're never going to know if you don't test it out. So that's the second question. What approaches do you want to test to get your foot in the door? Knowing that they may or may not work and being okay with that. Being okay with failing and learning and adjusting and iterating from there. And then the third question to put this episode into action is, how do you need to be thinking to make these approaches effective? Going back to the prerequisites that I shared with you. How do you need to be thinking about yourself? How do you need to be thinking about the other person in a way that gives you both the benefit of the doubt, that you know what you're talking about, you've got a valuable entry offer, that once you can be known to your ideal client, they'll want to talk to you. They'll want to meet with you because you've got something valuable to offer them, that entry offer, and it will be worth their time starting to get to know you and to understand that you are there and available as a resource and an expert in what you do. So that's what I have for you today in terms of getting your foot in the door at your ideal client and how to get in front of more decision makers. Thank you for tuning in today, and I will see you again next week. Take care. Thanks for joining me this week on the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. If you liked today's episode, I have 3 quick next steps for you. First, click subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Next, leave me a review in your podcast app so other independent consultants can find and benefit too. And finally, to put the ideas from today's episode into action, head over to melisaliberman.com for the show notes and more resources to help you grow your consulting practice from your first few projects into a full-fledged business. See you next week.